We're in charge of approximately $10 to $15 million of job training that comes through various government departments and agencies, both state but mostly federal. Our basic mission is to make sure that employers get the employees they need to be successful and to grow our Kent and Allegan County economies. So it's a bit of a daunting challenge as we face it. This particular group and committee and series of morning sessions is directed toward the issue of employees have issues that they have to overcome, either to maintain their employment and or to get a job. So if you look at the agenda that we passed out, it says eliminating unnecessary barriers to getting and keeping jobs. Yeah, and there are barriers, and we'll talk about one of them, and there are many, many. So we figured there's so many barriers and there's so much information the employment community has to understand that we ought to have a series of sessions, Fourth Friday sessions, where we cover various topics that are of concern to employers and employees both, mainly focusing on giving information to employers. So that's really what we're all about. Today we're going to talk about this issue of intergenerational workers, which is an issue that has come up numerous times within our board and whatever, and it was not something that we knew a lot about. And we did some research, found out a little bit about it, and said this is certainly something that we need to let people know, because when you have young and old workers working together, there are issues that are not apparent to either side, and the more they understand themselves, the better off they will be. So we've got three speakers today. Dave Smith, who's president of the Employers Association here in town, which has got probably 400 members now throughout the Kent County area, and he's given numerous talks on this subject. Fred Brown from Quantum, which is a human resource training organization, and Deb Leisinga from Ross Learning, which is one of our contractors, but she has worked directly with clients and has some. And basically, we asked them to give us their insights or stories, etc., on this very critical topic, and we'll have time then at the end for some questions and answers, and hopefully come out with anything that you may want to know. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Smith.
Thanks, Wynn. And thanks for having us here on this topic. When Wynn first asked me about presenting, I said, do you want my 2-hour or my 1-hour presentation? And he said, how about your 10-minute overview? And I guess that, in essence, is the reality of generational differences, too, is it took 80 years to develop this as an issue in the workforce. And we typically take about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about it. But there are issues and concerns that come out because of the different ages in the workforce. I'm a chemist and I'm in HR, so I look at things differently than most people do. And so probably from that standpoint, I'd like to try to establish why people are the way they are, what made them that way, and what are their values, and how do you deal with that. Then let Fred and Deb talk a little bit to the specifics about some of those things. I did put some materials in your packet there. The one with all the colorful little slides is mine, and I won't necessarily be going through that slide by slide, but it's some information for you. I guess I do want to just talk about some facts, though. Surprising to no one, the U.S. population is growing at a slower rate, which means we're aging more quickly than ever before. The result is we have different values, loyalties exist in an organization, different communication styles are needed to talk to those people. I have 3 kids from 19 to 24. Believe me, different communication styles are needed. They hear what they want to hear. But when you take that from the family and put it into the workplace, you start to get a little scared, because the reality is that's what you're dealing with in the workforce too. Doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're wrong, it means they're different. I think that's what we really need to deal with on any of these barriers issues, is there's not necessarily a right or a wrong, but there's a difference we need to recognize if we want to maximize everyone within a unified setting. Interpretation, story. I will start with one. I did an opinion survey when I first joined the association for a company, and I guess it's just to show that different people think about things differently. It was an organization that had a boomer in charge. He was in his, at the time, 50s. He had an older worker working for him. It was a tool and die shop. So there's a gentleman that was in his mid-70s that had retired, came back to work, was working 6-7 hours a day, coming into work, walking in the winter because he didn't work far away. And this boomer was saying, that's what I want in my workforce, somebody with those kinds of values. He'll come in, he'll work, he loves the place. I'd love to have a staff like that. Then I was talking to some of the younger employees in the workforce, and they said, you know, Fred over there, no attention, Fred.
As long as I'm the young guy, I don't care.
No, he's the old guy. He comes into work every day. I am not going to be like him when I get done here. He has to work. They have no retirement program for him. The company has just messed him over. He has to come into work. I'm going to be out of here the first chance I get. So here's a worker that the owner of the company was putting on a pedestal, and the workers was saying, I don't want to be like him. So I talked to the employee, and he knew exactly what was going on. He said, the owner thinks I love this job. I don't really love this job. It's a job. The younger guys think I have to work. I don't have to work. But if you ever met my wife, you'd know why I was here. Now, we look into things so deeply that sometimes the obvious isn't real. But those are the things that can come out in an intergenerational workforce. Is different people see things different ways. To understand some of the generations, I think we need to know what formed them. The vets, and I'll just throw out 4 main terms because those are kind of the commonly accepted generations. The veterans typically were born in the 1920s to the early 40s. I label them as the children of adversity. They were born and involved in wars. They had a depression. They had economic insecurity as they were growing up. It really helped to shape their values, but those situations shaped their values. The boomers were the 40s to the 60s, early 40s to around 1960. They were really shaped by relative peace in the world, by parental sacrifice. The parents sacrificed because they wanted something better for their kids. And from that standpoint, almost were children of destiny. But they had that opportunity. They were destined to be better than their parents. The parents sacrificed for them. Very competitive, though, because there were a lot of boomers born after the war. So to be on top, they had to really do something, become very competitive to stay on top. Very achievement-oriented. Gen Xers, the 1960 to 1980 time frame, were really our first latchkey kids. They became independent not so much by choice, but because of their parents' choices. That we had to work, we had to provide for our kids. Both sets of parents worked. Quite often, even more in the Y than the X, truly both sets of parents worked because we didn't have as much continuity in a family. But the Gen X's were formed by things like Watergate, the Challenger disaster, 3 Mile Island. PCs were an outlet for them. That was security, that was stability. Everything else is being jerked away. The things that you counted on weren't necessarily there for the Gen Xers. TVs and movies tended to have invincibility. Nothing could ever happen to them. If somebody died, they're going to be back on the screen tomorrow. And so a lot of things are shaping and forming the thought processes of the Gen X. And everything I'm doing are generalizations and extremes, so don't anybody get too stepped on when I'm talking about them. Gen Ys, Clintons, O.J. Simpsons. They were born in the 80s to the 2000s, and suddenly those strong things we hold as values aren't necessarily values. They're very situational in their values and their morality, and what's right can be demonstrated as right. Maybe they were over-parented. They had 2 sets of families, and they also had grandparents because everybody was growing up and spending time with them, protecting them. Had instant messenger. So what they wanted was there now. They had their own little self-contained world. Again, interpretations and values, we may sometimes see that as entitled. They just view it as an expectation. So the Gen Ys are probably more situational. They see what they see and will answer exactly what you want them to answer. My middle son is probably the biggest Generation Y example I can have. I came home from work once a few years back when actually his first day of kindergarten, he had been sent to the office. And I came home from work, and my wife was in tears. He was in tears. They were upstairs yelling at each other. She was saying, "Why did you go to the office? They said you hit somebody with leaves." "I just hit him with leaves. I don't know why they sent me." They're going back and forth. They've been going back and forth for an hour. I came home. She told me what was going on. I looked at him and said, how big of a stick were they attached to? Oh, about this big. But he had answered the question that was being posed of him, and he wasn't going to go beyond that. And again, generational issues, how you look at things and how you view things, can really create some issues in a workforce. And I think you have to understand people a little bit so that you can work and communicate with them. Values, veterans bring doing to a workforce. Very security-oriented, very loyalty-oriented. We'll call veterans the older workforce, as I'm just talking. Consistency, they do as they're told. Caution when you're managing a veteran workforce is they tend to do only as they're told. They're not really going to extend it because they want the security of pleasing you. Hard work, they're going to work, maybe take some time to play, and then work some more. Work comes first. So a veteran workforce, extremely strong in a workforce value, maybe limited on some of the innovation they're going to come up with, and maybe just because of the way we age and we slow down a little bit, may not be able to work as much as they used to, but the values are there. Great combination, great addition to a workforce. Boomers are initiators, they're leaders, they're growth-oriented, very competitive, they seek control. Something with a boomer, you have to be careful. They tend to expand their responsibilities. If you give them responsibilities, if you told them to do something, you might find out in a week they're doing 3 times as much. Maybe not even the thing they originally were doing. I had a boss once that told me I was a great problem solver. If I didn't have a problem to solve, I'd probably create one just so I could solve it. I think boomers tend to do that. But it's because they want that satisfaction of achieving, doing, being very competitive, being on top, being in control. Use them that way. Put them in control. But watch what you've assigned them. Don't look over their shoulder, but just make sure that the project you've assigned is moving along, and that is what they're working on, not 30 other projects that they want to do at the same time. Gen Xers, rather self-reliant, self-sufficient. Again, they were the latchkey kids, so because their parents weren't home, they had to become self-reliant and self-sufficient. But in a workplace, they can work on their own. We sometimes, though, and again, values, can see a Gen Xer as a bit of an instigator. They don't think the same way that boomers and veterans with traditional values think, which is true. They don't. They're troubleshooters. Sometimes their troubleshooting is because they're thinking of what's going to go wrong, and they're going to anticipate it, rather than boomers that tend to think very optimistically on what's going to go right. So there's just a different thought process. Excellent troubleshooters, but they come at things a little differently. Gen Xers are probably very self. They don't work, play. They self. And again, that's an interpretation from a boomer, so don't Gen Xers get too upset by it because it's a discussion creator. But in a workplace, boomers tend to be the bosses, and that's the way they view a Gen X workforce. Gen Y, very technical, very innovators. They grew up with a computer. They didn't invent it. They grew up with it. Again, my Gen Y kids can sit and stay on Instant Messenger, do an email search, watch TV, and talk on the phone at the same time. Do they do any of them really well? I would question that. But they do them all because they're very ADD. They focus on a lot of things in a lot of different areas at the same time. And you can capture that focus in a workforce if you recognize it and value it. If you want to put a Gen Y into a traditional cubicle and tell them to work on this one thing and tell me when it's done, you're probably going to turn them off and they're going to get to some real issues in the workforce. So again, you have to understand where people are coming from if you want to remove the barrier, because they are there and they're potential barriers if you don't address them. In the workplace, some of the loyalty considerations, veterans are very loyal to stability, authority, and consistency, and the organization. Boomers are loyal to opportunity, competitive superiority. Gen Xers tend to be loyal to themselves. They're going to take care of themselves, and if other people are along with them in a team, they'll take care of them too. Gen Y is starting to turn back. They're coming back to loyalty to an organization. They had some family values because of all those grandparents and parents dealing with them. I was at a session once where a speaker had commented that the Gen Ys that are coming out of college right now take the attitude of, I did college for you, Mom and Dad. Where we grew up saying that was for us. Now they want to have a couple of years to do what they want to do and go escape to the Peace Corps or whatever they want. And so it's a matter of, there is some time, but they want time, not necessarily money. You get a Gen Y on a job, and even early Gen X, give them time off, not necessarily pay. They're very sacred in their time because they value time to themselves. My youngest son once told my wife and I that when he grew up, he might get married, but he wasn't going to have kids. And he was 10 years old at the time. We said, why is that? He said, because I've seen the way you guys sacrifice for us, and I don't want to give up that much of my time for anybody. Now, they recognize things, but again, time is valuable to them. And as you're dealing with them in the workforce, you have to recognize that as an issue. Interactions in terms of how are people viewed. Very interesting, and I think you have to look at it, recognize it when you're dealing with the workforce. Veterans can quite often be viewed as very rigid, very narrow, very dictatorial, very focused, no life, no fun. They basically have all the money because they were around for a long time. They're business initiators. They're a temporary obstacle because they're just in the way sometimes, and will do what they are told and no more than what they're told. Now that's a view and a perception by some of the different generations. You have to, as a manager or as an employer, look at that and say, how can I utilize it? I put them on teams. They will follow through. They'll be the detail people with some of these initiators, innovators that don't necessarily take the time to follow through and are out doing 30 other things. Boomers, how are they viewed? Veterans quite often think of boomers as being rather self-absorbed. Gen Xers look at them as workaholics. Gen Ys start to think they're kind of cool because they listen to the same rock music that they like, and they listen to the same kinds of things that they like. So you start to get some linkages of generations, and I think you need to recognize that as an employer as to who works best on teams together. Gen Xers, how are they viewed? They get the rap. They're not viewed well by anybody, I'm afraid. The vets don't think they respect authority. They don't have a clue what hard work is. Boomers think they're slackers. They're kind of rude. Yers think they're probably constantly depressed and they need to cheer up. What is an X generation? That's probably why it's X-Files, X generation. Not understood by a lot of people, but they have a lot of energy. They took computers from the basic desktop computer into a computer that they developed systems for and solutions. So they're innovators. They take the system, they develop the system, and then maybe hand it off to the Ys so that they can use it and expand on it. But they're developers, they're innovators. And you have to recognize and understand that, not just look at it as a wrap. But that's probably one of the bigger barriers that we have. Those are the generations that are coming up to take the place of us boomers, and those are the ones we're probably saying, that's scary. You have to understand people to accept them. Gen Yers, how are they viewed by others? Vets think they're smart, but they watch probably too much TV. Boomers think that they need more discipline. They receive too much attention. Xers probably think that the Gen Yers are spoiled. Generally, the Gen Yers coming up are viewed as kind of naive and overprotective. Scary thing, and a barrier that you as an employer may have to look at, and it came up at one of my CEO conferences I went through at associations, and I've heard of 2 sightings in the West Michigan area, but Gen Ys are having their parents come to them to interviews with them for jobs. They are coming and saying, what are you going to do for my child? What are you going to give for benefits? What are you going to give for pay? Helping formulate the questions, following up on the interviews, calling, what have you done with this interview and this child? A very protected generation. And when you start to get a team interview, I know I wouldn't hire, probably that's just my impression and my stereotype of it, but it's happening. And that, again, as an employer, you're going to have to look for and think about. Training, there's different considerations for training. I'll let our other 2 speakers a little bit talk about that, but just as kind of a broad overview, you probably wouldn't want to train a vet with an email or technology communication because computers made my mom retire. She quit the school when they said that she had to type on a computer instead of a typewriter. And so with training, why do you do interactive training if you want a vet to listen to it? And if you do things in print, Gen Y doesn't read very many books. They do things on the computer, so you probably wouldn't want to have a training manual over to a Gen Y person. If you did something to a vet, make sure it's large print because they probably don't want to struggle to read the small print. Make sure there aren't any language barriers, which is probably, I'm sure, another barrier that's going to come up in the future in terms of literacy. But as an overview, and to try to get something down from an hour and a half, and I've gone over about 3 minutes. There are differences, and I guess I would really focus on that as an employer or as an employee looking for a job, is that the generations bring different values with them, different frameworks, different thought processes. Doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean they're right. They can interact very well together, but you have to recognize where they're coming from if you're going to maximize them onto a team. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fred.
Boy, Dave, I think you pretty much got everybody. I'm not sure if you left anybody out there. Send emails and letters to Dave Smith. No. Very well done. Thank you. One of the things that I'll add, I guess, in terms of looking at intergenerational, just recently my grandmother turned 100 years old. So we had about 100 or so folks, relatives at our house. And it was interesting to see the generations. I remember because when we talked about when she was born in 1906, that was the San Francisco earthquake, and there was a few things going on. They actually had at that time, I think they were saying they had almost 800 miles of road in the United States in 1906. So that was just, when she was born, considered to today. As our family read these little placemats and went through a few things, you could see the veteran type generation and the boomers were extremely impressed that Grandma had lived to be 100. And we kind of gathered around and went through the process of thanking her and feeling good. Where the rest of the group, I guess you might call that would be the Xers and the Yers, spent the majority of the time trying to figure out when were they going to get some food, when were we, where were we going to go, where's the fun, what were you doing for us, what are you doing for us in order to take care of us. And it was interesting because my wife commented towards the end when the boomers and the veterans, was cleaning up. And with that, she said to me, she said, I've never felt like people were, always asking me what they were expected. I would be wandering around and they would say, well, where's the pop? And they wouldn't, you'd say, one person might say, can I help you and get some pop? And the other group might say to her, where is it and when are you going to put it out? You can determine yourselves, which is which. But I believe that there's always this somewhat perception that the older generation views the younger generation as, these a bunch of people who don't work for things, who somewhat are entitled, right? We kind of think in terms of, they're entitled to things, or they think that they're entitled. And entitlement kind of rubs us the wrong way. Whereas the younger generation maybe has a tendency to think in terms of, I'm owed this certain amount of service. I'm owed this from my employers. Transitioning from what happened at my house, in 1984, I wrote a thesis paper on alternative forms of motivation. The company that I'd worked for at the time was a Fortune 500 company, gave me 47 people to pay any way I wanted. I could pay them any way I wanted. I could figure out a new way to motivate people. Now, I'm not sure how many in the audience are familiar with what was called big stick theory, right? Remember big stick theory? If you look at the veterans of the older generation, management used what we call big stick theory back then in order to motivate them. You do your job or you're fired. And back in the 30s and late 40s, there were no jobs, right? So they used big stick theory. Well, as there became more jobs and people were vying for that, and I remember my grandfather telling me, many stories about leaving for a job at 25 cents an hour to go to a job at 30 cents an hour. And his point at that time was in terms of big carrot theory. All right, they had gone, employers had moved from big stick theory into big carrot theory in the 50s and the 60s. So big stick is I'm gonna whack you one or I'm gonna fire you, and big carrot is you do a part, I'll give you a nickel. You do 2 parts, I'll give you 2 nickels. Right? You work a little harder, I'll give you 5% instead of 7%. Well, I think those were reactions to folks in terms of how we try to manipulate them rather than motivate them. Fear and greed are manipulators. So my thesis was on the premise that all people want to achieve and do not want to be manipulated. So we have to take what's called external factors of manipulation, or external factors of motivation, which are things like pay, supervision, company policy, those types of things have to be taken out and replaced with the work itself, the recognition and the advancement, the ability to have growth. Those would be intrinsic or internal motivation. I mean, I like you folks, all right, but I had to set my alarm this morning to get up. All right? Now, tomorrow, if I have a golf date, I don't have to set my alarm, all right? My alarm in my head internally will go off. I kind of like golf more than maybe I like work. So now when we take a look at this, back in 1984, this group was then paid differently. They were given immediate feedback. They had feedback systems set up that gave them feedback on their production, their scrap rates, their quality rates instantly as they wanted it. They became the highest paid, produced the best quality throughout the whole organization because of this feedback mechanism. What's interesting is, as we went forward and put this in other places because it was successful, the other places, although they improved, didn't have quite the success of this first group. And so what I think I drew from that is the first group had a lot of achievement type stuff, a lot of people looking at them. They not only had external motivators, they had internal stuff going on because they had a sense of achievement, they were new, they were the first. When we take a look at intergenerational and those folks, I kind of have an intergenerational family. My oldest son's 29, my youngest is 9. When we look at the kids today, and I've coached Little League for about 25 years now, when we look at kids today, they have structured. They get a star, they do their homework, they get a star. They have, my son at home has like 47 stars already on his refrigerator, and school's what, 3 weeks old? Right? I mean, so he's got all his stars for getting his homework done, for doing his reading. And when other generations went to school, they didn't get stars. They got whacked, all right, when you didn't get your homework done. So I think that what happened, looking at the group in 1984, that as we went forward and laid this stuff out, I believe that the intergenerational people are more motivated by what we call internal factors, because they've grown up with immediate feedback from the video games, immediate feedback from structural type playing. You go out to the ballpark now, and almost all the kids, you don't grab a bat and a ball and find your buddies and go play ball anymore. What you do is you join some type of a league, and you get organized. And what do you get when you win? I mean, my son's now, what do you get? Well, you get this trophy, or you get this. So they go back to what external things. So maybe as parents or as a generation, we've adapted big stick theory to the veterans and the boomers. We've adapted maybe the big carrot theory to some of the boomers and the Xers. And now we're trying to work what we call empowerment, team-based incentives. We're trying to adapt to the late Xers and the Yers in terms of allowing them to get some immediate feedback or being part of this team. That's what people are trying to do in terms of motivating these folks. I would say this in terms of advice. In the employer's defense, what we have to do is to not, as far as policies goes, those things are not motivators to Xers and Yers. Your policy and your pay, which is typically, they are not motivators. And so what you do is you want to make sure that they're not dissatisfiers. All right? We can only be dissatisfied with our pay. We cannot be motivated by pay. So what we have to do then, when we're working with boomers or veterans, is understand that they just don't want to not be dissatisfied. Where the big change, when you're looking at from an employer standpoint, when you go to Xers and Yers, you must provide opportunities for them to be satisfied. You have to tell them and provide much more feedback in terms of where they can get their next raise, where they can take control themselves and find a job path to get what they want. and go forward with that. Now, as a person or a job seeker, and Quantum does a lot of assessments, and so it's interesting because we'll assess people, and you'll see some folks from different generations that assess quite differently, quite frankly. And job seekers have to understand that about I think DOL says 78% of the people controlling or in charge of management positions are the veterans, or are the older generation. And if you come in and the first two questions you ask are, how much pay, how much time off can I have, what are my benefits, that person views that immediately as entitlement and almost automatically doesn't want to hire you. It's okay to have that conversation, but if somebody gave me advice a long time ago when I was a young engineer, and they said, you know, you're arrogant if you're the first person to give an idea when you're a rookie. All right, but you're smart when you're the last person to give an advice or give an idea when you're a rookie. So as a job seeker coming to a new organization, the question can be asked, but it's got to be at the second or third interview in terms of try to ask more questions around what the company does and how the company was formed. Have some interest in how the organization created itself. Now, so that's, you know, when a job seeker goes out towards an interview, I think that's where they have to focus, or the advice that I would give them. Hold off on your needs, okay, and until you've at least gotten through the interview and might be the person who's going to be hired. Okay. With that, I'll turn it over. I'll take it over, Deb, and run with that.
Thank you. This is all very fascinating information to me, and I learned about intergenerational workers a couple of years ago, actually, at the Michigan Works Conference, as many of you were there, and I look across the room and I see many service providers here, contract providers, and from my perspective, when workers come in looking for employment, or prospective workers come in looking for employment, and I'm going to assist them with it, the first thing I'm looking at is they've got to recognize that they're looking at their employer or prospective employer as a customer. So people come into Straight Street and they're required, you know, or the WIA, the Michigan Works Service Centers, and they want employment. And so the first thing I'm going to ask them is, what kind of skills do you have to sell to an employer? And then I'm going to show them how to market those skills. Because as we talk about intergenerational, and as Fred mentioned, and it's a very good point, as we talk about intergenerational workplace, we have got to figure out a way to get our people, and I see many service providers here, our people into that workplace. Now, frequently getting them into the workplace really isn't, as you all know, really isn't the biggest problem we have. It's keeping them in that workplace. So as a service provider, I step back, and if you walk into any of our classes, we're teaching this stuff. We're demystifying how it is people keep employment. And how is it that they keep employment? They learn problem-solving skills. They have to learn that they're going to be working with multiple kinds of people in multiple kinds of situations. And so we not only give them the hard skills of how to produce a resume and how to get that interview, you know, get through that interview, not asking what pay is. That's very, very important. But we also give them the soft skills needed that maybe is not taught at home and that wouldn't come to you intuitively, that these are the things that you're going to meet with. You may be interviewing with a boomer, and that boomer is going to look at you a little differently than you expect them to look at you. They're going to look at your dress. You may not think that it's important to come dressed in certain attire or that a tattoo showing, because many people have tattoos now, but a boomer is going to say, what kind of person am I hiring here? So we're selling. With it, we need to start looking at the employer as the customer, and we need to send our people into employers looking at them as a customer. I've got something I want to sell to you. I've got time and skills I want to lease to you. So when they go into the workplace now, frequently we've all been there where we don't necessarily have to agree with the values of a person. We don't have to necessarily like the person that we work with, but we do have to kind of get along with them. And those are the things that this information tells us. Okay? This is the values that we need to apply in order to keep the job, and not only keep the job but excel at the job. I'm a boomer, and of course, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I'm going to flip hats here because I am an employer, and many of you know my staff, so I'm going to give you a couple of ha-has on them, and you can laugh at them later. But one of the things, as a boomer, we like to talk face-to-face. We like those relationships. And so I would get calls from our contracting agency Asset, and with a, hey, Deb, you need to change whatever. And I'll say, okay, right away. And I run out into the hall, because that's the way I like to operate, because I do face-to-face kind of communication. I go out in the hall and say, hey, guys, we need to do whatever differently. Let everybody else know. And everybody would come out in the hall and they'd go, okay, that sounds interesting, okay, and then they'd go and disperse. Well, at some of our trainings, at some of our communications, and I think that's real important to do, and that's how we're going to learn the things that we need to change within the workplace and how to work with intergenerational workers, is there came the feedback, hey, cut the hall talk. And I say, oh, I'm not dumb. I can learn. Okay, send it out on an email is what I got. All right, I'll send it out on an email. So I dutifully went back into my office and started sending out emails. Now that didn't please me very much because I'm that face-to-face person. And what I found, what do you think happened? It didn't please some other people either. Because I have intergenerational workers, it pleased those younger workers, but it did not please the workers that were my age and even the workers that were older, because I have workers, believe it or not, I have workers older than me too. And it didn't please them. So you kind of think the Winnie the Pooh thing. And I realized I have an assistant director who is a Generation Xer, and she's the one who wanted me to quit the hall talk, and she's the one who wanted, along with some other people her age, that said technology, because they're technology savvy. Well, guess what we did? She emails, very happy emailing. I go out in the hall and hall talk. We have a happy staff now. It's kind of silly, but we have a happy staff. One of the other things that came out of this, and sometimes you just stumble over things. You discover things. And one of the things that we have, and many of you know about it, on-the-job training contracts. You have so many that you have to have a year. And it was getting toward about June or so, and I didn't have as many as I needed. And my problem is I was not getting, my case managers were not talking to my employer account reps. They were not giving them the information they needed, that folks were getting employed was not getting to the employer account reps, so the employer account reps could talk to the employers to get those contracts ready, okay, and to sell our customers to them. So, knowing what I know about Generation Xers and the millennial, there's a cheat sheet here for you guys that I printed out. And Dave was talking about Generation Y. I have them on here as millennials. So you can just kind of mark that so that you know the game plan. But what I know about them is they like time off. Okay? That's what they value. Their goal in life is work is a means to an end. They come to work and they go home and they spend that money. They have fun. It's not, work is not their end all. I don't understand it. I thought that they had some issues personally, maybe some work ethic issues, but from the standpoint of a boomer. But realizing that they value family, They value being out of the office. So what we did is we set up a little performance incentive. Is if the case managers got information to the employer account reps of an OJT possibility, they would get a half a day off. That worked pretty good. Suddenly my productivity goes up. I made my numbers for the year. And then on top of that, if they also communicated with the employer account reps as our 90-day count goes, as many as you know about, they would also get another half a day off. Productivity was wonderful with the Generation Xers and the Generation Ys. What do you think about the boomers? What do you think happened there? It was a struggle. It was a struggle. So what do I add to that is recognition. I couldn't pay them more money for doing that, but I could recognize their hard work and did back to the face-to-face, good job, in front of people, in front of the rest of the staff, recognition, these are good people, these are leaders. Sometimes you stumble over kinds of things like this, and with this information, you can really apply it to the success, to promote productivity in your workers. There's a couple of things on the last page of this. For more information, we actually had a wonderful article as a committee, and it's on mayoclinic.com, and I wanted to reproduce that for you, but that's illegal. But each of you can go on this mayoclinic.com, and the name of the article is Workplace Generation Gap, Understand the Differences Among Colleagues. You can look that up. You can print that off for yourself. I just can't print it off for the multitudes. But that's a great resource. Read it. It's sometimes it's good to have things in your hand to look over again and again. So that's a great resource. The other thing that I use frequently is a book called Coaching for Improved Work Performance. And I have to pull that out. Now, it doesn't necessarily talk about intergenerational workers, but it does talk about coaching to performance. So if you take the information that you have today and the information from coaching to improve work performance, you can really bring your workers up. And I think that all of us here or you can excel your success in the workplace. Because if we don't have employees working for us, then we're looking for advancement. Maybe, I don't know, I'm a boomer. So some of you others may have to tell me if that's so. So this is, take this, use it, enjoy it, and I think that we're open for questions.
I think maybe Wynn, if I could, before we open for questions, two things to expand on some points that were made. We are about 560 members now, so we do come up with a lot of issues and stories that come up. One of the things a member had called about discipline, and they were looking at discipline as the traditional discipline of threatening somebody with time off. And a veteran, you threaten with a day off, they're going to die. I get a call from someone that says, my policy says a day off. I went to an employee and they said, why just a day? Can't I have a week? Now, real issues, but you have to face them. Also, in terms of policies, that Fred had commented, be careful of your policies. A policy that has been in existence forever is bereavement time. You get time off for the death of a spouse or family member. I had an employer call and say, we give 3 days off for the death of a wife, and I had an employee that his wife died in December and he wants to take trout season off his 3 days because he figures she would have rather he did that, and he wants to bereave in his own time. Now, they give 3 days off, they didn't specify the time frame. What do you do with that? So you have to really be careful with the way your policies are sometimes worded. And they ended up bracketing between the time of death and the day of the funeral. But you have to have sometimes your policies worded to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Or you're going to be surprised.
Questions for panelists? As I'm thinking here, I was thinking about something I learned about universities. You're going to love this one. And this was the president's office of this particular university, and a person that worked for the president. And somebody had asked, how do you like your new job? And she said, well, most of it I really, really like. but I really, you can imagine which generation this is, but I really don't understand that I'm spending an incredible amount of time dealing with the parents of all my students. They don't like their roommate. They don't like their classes. And what do? They call the president. Call the president. I can't imagine doing that. And yet, it's a real issue. And it's just, and I was thinking about how my kids work with cell phones. You call your kids, and all my kids are between 20 and 30, so they're that generation. And invariably, I'll say, well, did you get my message? And they'll say, no, I just called you back. Because the minute they see the call, they just call back. Well, why did I take the time to put the message on? They were going to listen to it anyway. But it's just the way they operate, which is so different. That immediate that you're talking about, that immediate way of doing things is just so foreign to a boomer like me that you got to kind of, okay, if that's the game, then I got to do that, And you find yourself having to change the way you do it, and you have to do different things for different people. Other questions and comments, Ms. Davis?
This is another real-life situation, and I'd like to ask how the panelists would address it. There was, I think this employee would fall into the millennial area and was working, knew the job description, and it's along the line of what Wayne was saying, enjoyed doing, let's say 75% of their job description, but literally said, I don't like those other things, I'm not going to do them. I'll do the 75%, but I won't do those other things. And and stood their ground. So how would you address that? That's a real live.
I think it depends what position that you come from. If you're a boomer, you might approach it a little differently if you are not educated in some of these techniques, and if it's a valuable employee that you want to keep. I saw Sylvia back there whacking a stick.
I'm with Sylvia.
You're with Sylvia? Hit the stick. See, we're a lot of boomers in there.
I've learned to moderate. I would probably say get rid of them because they're not doing the job.
Yeah.
But you have to really look at it. Is that 75% valuable?
Mm-hmm.
If so, can you be flexible in your workforce and have somebody work part-time to do that 75% and reassign duties? Because I wouldn't pay somebody for a full job if they're not doing the full job. But before I just whacked them, which is a reaction and a response, I'd probably say, how can I work with it to gain the value from the employee they can offer without getting rid of the employee? If I couldn't, I'd have to get rid of the employee. But always just take the step in terms of how can they contribute and how can you work with it.
A comment to that. One of the things that we find with the older generation is they internally connect the dots back to job responsibility. In other words, they're more interested in their job not being dissatisfying. So they put up with what annoys them in order to receive a paycheck. They put up with some things that might annoy them 25% of the time for the items that go to 75%. What you have to do with that, with the younger generation, if that's who we're talking about in terms of the 25%, is you have to connect the dots for them. Mm-hmm. The 25% is, what's the rationale for why you have to do that? I owned a small manufacturing company. I had two welders. One was 60, the other one was 22. The one that was 60 pretty much gauged his job based on the fact that he got a paycheck, he did a good job, and every once in a while, you give him some feedback on how he did. The 22-year-old was always complaining about certain parts of the job that he didn't like. The 60-year-old didn't like it either, but didn't complain about it. What's interesting is I went to the 22-year-old and I started explaining to them why we needed to do the paperwork part of it, why we needed to fill the paperwork out, why this was important so that people would get billed. If you don't fill out the paperwork, then people don't get the bill, we don't get paid, you don't get paid. That was the end of it. The rationale was fine. So there's always pushback sometimes, I think, in terms of the folks that when they find things that are annoying to them, they call the president, as Wynn said. You know, they complain about it. They don't have that fear, that big stick theory that says, well, I'm not going to complain because they might fire me. They're not worried about that. So if you can't connect the dots, though, then you should fire them, because there are a bunch of Xers looking at this behavior, and if that person gets away with it, they're going to follow. So now you got to think in the other terms. So you connect it for them, and if that doesn't change their behavior, then you have to follow through with the consequences. I leave that out.
Just one more comment on that too, is we got to remember that this particular person doesn't have the experience of an Xer, so they haven't been maybe fired for behavior, non-performance. And connecting the dots is a coaching method to help them understand, and really they may be a very valuable worker if you coach them to success. So it's very important to try that first.
Yeah, it depends a lot on whether this person's what you'd call a high performer. I mean, if you had somebody who's a high performer on the 75% and you're really having trouble with the 25%, you might look at some different things. If their general performance is just average, then you probably would approach it differently. But let's assume for a minute that they're a high performer. Well, then you'd say, well, you can't ignore it because the 25% is not getting done. So you might go to them and say, we have a problem we need to solve here. And then use some of the techniques that you just talked about and see if indeed they would be part of it. The other way, if you really felt strongly that this person's 75% was of value and want to retain the person, you might push them to say, well, what other 25% could you do? Because I'm really old school in the sense I think jobs morph to the people more than this is what you got to do kind of thing. Now, obviously, you need all the things to get done in an organization that need to get done, and you have to have people perform those. So sometimes you do have to take your job description and you have to morph it to the individuals. Now, it's particularly true in executive positions, which I'm more used to, but even at the lower levels, you've got to be more flexible sometimes. But just because somebody said, this is the way it's always been done, and these are the things this position always has done, then if you had a high talent person, again, I wouldn't do that if it was an average performer, but if you really said, I hate to lose this person over this 25%, then I think you got to say, well, how can I get that done? And I think the manager's got to look at it, a little differently. But
I think this happened to, when I said it's a real life situation, lots of real life situations that happen, of course, to one of my friends, not me personally. But I think even when I experienced it with this, my friend, I think for us, getting over the shock and disbelief that an employee would literally say, I'm not doing that. Like that. Oh no, I'm not doing this. And her, the employer, what? Because, you just don't ever hear that.
Yeah.
You hear but I guess you can appreciate the fact that someone tells you they're not gonna do it. So you don't, when you evaluate them, you don't expect that they were working on it or give some excuse as to the fact that they were trying to work on it. No. So thank you. Those were excellent.
well, be open to the fact that some, and if men are from Mars and women are from Venus, that stuff. But be open to the fact that sometimes people say things that they don't totally mean.
Yeah.
What they're trying to do is to let you know that this is really, really unpleasant to them and it's not an enjoyable thing. And once you listen to that, they end up sometimes overcoming the issue and get on with it. And that is a possibility. And sometimes, and some managers are not good at being willing to listen to, that type of fact. They just want to solve it. And that's the way, my generation, actually my wife and I both try to do that. We're always trying to solve people's problems for them instead of just listening and letting them, relieve. And sometimes that's really all it is. It's not a real issue. And it's tough sometimes because you got to know the individual. But if it continues and persists, obviously you have to do something about it because the 25% does have to get done.
Okay.
Any other question? Oh,
Yep.
now we're
Is there
going.
value? Because obviously in this scenario, you're talking about a person you have that's already under your employ. So how much value do you place on changing your interview approach or your screening approach so that you don't even encounter that type of negative situation?
I think you absolutely have to change that. There's a competency called Motivational Fit, And there's a lot of employers now are switching to what we call behavioral interviewing. And so they begin to ask, let's say the job itself has a lot of tedious type items. So during the interview process, you talk to the person about their hobbies. They tell you they like to put together little models and they like working with their hands. Well, that tells you to the fact that their behavior, they're going to like that. And motivational fit is always is about how much of the job annoys them versus how much of the job that they actually like. There are a lot of people, and I'll give you an example, that'll move away from West Michigan and take a job in New York City, and they take the job because they love the job or they think that's good. But what happens is they go to New York City and that city annoys them so much that after 6 months they quit a job that pays them twice as much and comes back to Western Michigan. This is a true story. So part of your interview process has to be motivational fit. Motivational fit breaks down into 3 categories. Location, which you want to make sure that with a person that came from one location comes to the location they're going to. The second is the job fit, which is likes versus dislikes. And then finally, in terms of the organizational fit, what types of things are the organization involved in? I mean, you got to look at certain, whatever the value system of the individual coming into the organization. So those are good things to interview for and good techniques during the interview process to always watch out for, the motivational fit.
Dan?
I know, real quick. What's the kids being born today? What's the name of that group and any predictions?
I think they would still be in that millennial tail end. I don't know if they've come up with a new term yet. And those are always after the fact. Yeah. Once you see somebody is acting differently than everybody else, you've got to give them a name, a label. They're not old enough to know that yet.
I have a nickname for them. I'll predict that they're going to be called the SAs. For Smart Alex. That's all. That's my whole. That's cleaned up. That's cleaned up a little bit. That's just my prediction. No, I'll run with that. It's interesting because my 9-year-old, he already has his own laptop. Has for the last 3 years. He just set up his own network for his. I have a nephew. He's setting up the network at home. And my oldest son, who's 29, in some regards is a tweener, he went through school, and when he went through school, there were no computers. And so his ability to adapt to computers, he's still kind of at the user end of it. And so, yeah, I think we might just call them tech weenies. I mean, you're going to see a lot of people that come out of this generation. We thought the last generation was technically ahead of us. This next generation coming up. You go to some of the schools now that I went to, and they're like second grade doing PowerPoint presentations. Yes. All right, this is phenomenal. So you're going to see a very technology. That's a little more serious to that question, but I think you're going to see that.
They are going to have a real hard time communicating, though, face to face, conversationally, because all the communication is driven technologically.
Yeah. My son had 3 kids over last night with 3 computers, and they were all playing a different game in a different place. But there had 3 computers linked up. They were all playing together, individually, on their PC. My wife and I were walking around a kitchen table getting ready for dinner thinking, you got to be kidding. I mean, this is just ridiculous. But that's exactly what they're doing to Dave's point. So,
one more question. Somebody else had one?
In the back.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Not necessarily a question, but a comment. It's interesting the perspective that you're putting forward that it's the people in power that actually have to make the transition, whereas the people that are seeking jobs really should be the people being educated and maybe taught how to work within an entire system.
Yeah, they really both need to. I mean, I guess it's always about communication back and forth.
That's right.
I think Deb was talking about the individual seeking a job has got to look at it differently, but we have to look at it differently too.
I've had a lot of conversations with my middle son about why should I change? I'm who I am. What does it matter what people think of me when I can do the job? I say, well, that may be very true, but you have to think that people that are thinking of you don't think that way. And you have to get the foot in the door to show what you can do. And you're right. We do a lot of changing. Other people have to also. But we're probably in a position to change because we also need to accomplish something.
Yeah. Maybe a Department of Labor stat says that 33% of the workforce that you currently have today will be gone within 10 years. They talk about that 33% also taking with them 80% of the knowledge. So if you're looking at an organization today, and in 10 years, 80% of your knowledge base is going to be gone. So your ability to work with those folks that are remaining behind, mentor them, and get them up to speed on, you know, making business decisions and business acumen, as opposed to making decisions about, as Deb mentioned, where you know, I'm looking for time off, or you know, there's a lot of people that would never consider taking a vacation during a crisis at work, and there are some folks that are out there now that would be like, so what? You know, it's just the job, and they have to be educated to some point that, you know, that has to go through. So I think we're running into that. We're going to run into that with that stat coming up.
Well, I think a round of applause would be. Please fill out your survey. We really need the feedback. We're a new group, and we need to know what we can do better. You know, and hand it to Christy right at the door. Won't let you leave without it. Our next one will be on helping employers and employees to prepare for layoffs, downsizing, or closing. We call it rapid response, and it is a reality in almost all workplaces that they know they're going to have to let people go, which is probably the most common, and we have lots of ways of dealing with that situation that can help the employees, you know, through the employers, and that's what the session will be about next time. So the 4th Friday. Thanks a lot for coming.